This season of Recap is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. As Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm, Maurice Blackburn believes the law should serve everyone, not just those who can afford it. They've helped influence some of Australia's most important legal decisions, including equal pay for women and Indigenous workers, and helped over 500,000 Australians get the compensation they deserve. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Experience you can count on.
Hello, and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's research and policy podcast, where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, lands which were never ceded, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm your host, Emma Dawson, and this week we'll be discussing the 2024-25 federal budget with a focus on its brand new housing statement. Joining me today is Lucy Tonkin. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Emma.
Lucy's our Andrew Herington Fellow at Per Capita, working in the Centre for Equitable Housing, which we launched in 2023. So, Lucy, talk us through this year's budget. What was new about this year, particularly in relation to housing, compared with previous budgets?
So the biggest new addition to this year's budget was the addition of what was called a housing budget statement. And that specifically talked about the challenges that we're facing in Australia's housing affordability crisis, and also the specific policies relating to housing that have been laid out. And this is a really great addition. So this is in Budget Paper 1, which is the big document that announces all of the budget measures, and then Treasury's justifications for spending money in a specific way. And it also talks about all the government revenue, risks, assets and liabilities. So this year, there's a budget statement called Meeting Australia's Housing Challenge. This is a 42-page document, and it contains a list of all new budget measures relating to housing, as well as new measures that have been kind of announced since May 2020. So there's basically just a bit of a refresher on everything that's been announced.
Since the government came to power in 2022, yeah?
Yeah, 2022, sorry. Yeah, so everything that's been announced since the May 2022 election. So this is a notable development because in the past, it's been really difficult to develop a comprehensive account of government spending on housing.
Yeah, and we found that, didn't we, when we did the research for On Whose Account, which we released in January.
Absolutely. So in that report, we try to make a comprehensive account of like the real federal budget on housing. And that was given the lack of information that was available in previous budgets. So in previous budgets, you really had to dig through to see exactly how much money was being spent on housing. It was across multiple budget papers. Some of it was in the form of payments to states. Some of it was DSS payments. And it was almost impossible. A lot of it was kind of estimations. So what we did do was we pulled together all the expenditure on housing and related endeavours announced in the 2023 and 2024 budget. And then we also tracked trends in housing expenditure over time. And we also looked at how much taxation revenue had been foregone through tax breaks to investors, so the negative gearing allowances and the capital gains tax discount. In that report, we found that over the past 3 decades, expenditure through property investor tax concessions had skyrocketed, as well as spending on Commonwealth rent assistance. And in contrast, the spending on things like social housing had really dropped over time.
And that I think, points us back to when, as you said, we had to look in the social security portfolio for the spending on Commonwealth rent assistance, in Treasury and Finance for transfers to the state. There's no because there's no housing ministry, there's no housing portfolio budget statement. But this year we've seen that, at least on the spending side, and we'll get to that in a minute, all pulled together into the one place to show that there has been a significant uplift in government spending on a housing. And I think they wanted to show that they were doing that, but also that they understood the scale of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, in the report, we did call for a dedicated Department of Housing. That hasn't happened, but it is really great that in lieu of that, there has been kind of that movement towards the more comprehensive accounting through the statement within Budget Paper 1. And it was quite surprising, quite a welcome development overall. It just makes us so much easier to understand and actually just comment on government expenditure. You don't feel like you've kind of missed out on something that was just kind of secretly announced and not in the main budget paper. And I think really it is just like a big win for transparency within such like an important area of policy making.
And a big win for policy nerds and research nerds like us, right? Because
absolutely. Yeah, it's just so good. Totally. There's just a table at the end and you can just flick through that table and, if you don't have the information, it is very hard to kind of critique it effectively. So it's a great development overall.
But some critical things missing. I mean, when we looked at on whose account, we really went through total spending, didn't we? So what does the housing statement say, but more, what does it not say? What is it what we expected, and what does it do well, and what's missing, Lizzie?
Yeah, it's really a mixed bag. So the housing statement does a really great job at illustrating the severity of the housing affordability crisis. So it shows the rapid increases in dwelling values over the past 3 decades, and then also the severe jump in median advertised rents that have kind of been seen since the COVID-19 pandemic. So it also demonstrates that lower income households are paying a higher share of their income to service their rents, and that households are paying a larger share of their incomes to service new home loans than during the GFC. So it's as bad as it's ever been. And it also really shows the long-term retreat from government investment in social housing. I don't think it shies away from that.
No,
so there's absolutely, yeah. So there's a number of graphs showing the reduction of public housing completions, which has more or less trended downwards since the 1980s, except for like a little spike during the GFC. And it also shows the health, economic and social impacts of housing affordability challenges. We've known for a very long time that a lack of affordable housing prevents workers from living near their job. It can interrupt children's education if they have to move frequently. And it can be such a driver of poor mental and physical health. The underlying anxiety of having insecure tenure arrangements, to be over-leveraged on your mortgage, just really over the long term is just such a health crisis. So that's really great to be acknowledged in such a high-level document. And it really just shows that housing is such an essential part of your life, and it just hasn't been treated as such in policy over the last very, very long time.
Yeah, I think, we while we're going to get into, what we wish was there that isn't, and what we'd like to still see, it's important to note that, to have a government that's actually willing to say there is a role for government in housing, and it's not just something that should be left to the market. And these are the social problems that a lack of secure, affordable housing are causing across our country. Very welcome to see that set out by the folk in Treasury and Finance who've done this. So what are some of the measures, Lucy, that are in the budget statement? What were some of the new spending and specific measures that we've seen?
So there's a boost of Commonwealth rent assistance. There's also $1 billion in funding for states and territory for the delivery of what's been called housing enabling infrastructure. And that will be given to the states just to kind of create basically quicker construction. And
that's important, isn't it? I know some people have said, well, that's not housing money, but as a planner yourself, as an urban planning person, you'd agree that infrastructure money is pretty important, right?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think these things have to go hand in hand. Councils are more looking towards getting developers to pay for infrastructure provision, but it's just good to have that money in the pipeline, making sure that those projects can go ahead.
Yeah, there was a story here in Melbourne the other day that the city of Melton, which is out in Melbourne's west, and it's the fastest growing region in Australia, and they are struggling to keep up the infrastructure build. In new housing estates. And the way that councils do this, of course, is by charging a levy to developers. So this is additional money. Now it's $1 billion. It's not gonna be a lot. But,
you have to be realistic there.
But again, it's a kind of acknowledgement that councils can't do these things on their own, and that there's a role for government to do that. Yeah,
absolutely. That's very true.
Yeah. What else is in there?
So there's also the 10-year Northern Territory Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which aims to deliver 270 houses a year in remote communities in the Northern Territory. As well as that, there's also $88 million over 3 years for training programs within the construction sector. And obviously that's a really great development. We've heard a lot about construction shortages over the last few years. We can't really build homes if there's not the skills and the personnel to build them. As well as that, probably one of the biggest developments was the 5-year National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness. So that will be $9.3 billion delivered to states and territories over 5 years. This isn't necessarily new funding. It's a continuation of a long line of funding agreements for the states and territories for social housing construction. The most recent, people might recognise its name, was called the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, but it goes all the way back to post-war funding for social housing. It's not necessarily a new commitment that we haven't seen before. The budget does state that there will be an extra $400 million for homelessness services. But however, aside from this, the agreement does look more or less like the previous iteration. It doesn't seem like any sort of real boost to social housing is going to come through this funding. It appears that it will be something separate if it does happen over the next few years.
We're going to get in now to some of the things that the downsides, that, things we didn't like. And I'll just preface that by saying there was a piece in the Saturday paper last week, on the 29th of June, about our friends at National Shelter and Homelessness Australia, and the fact that their government funding, which was cut under the Morrison government, has not been restored.
Yeah.
And those peak bodies, I'm going to put a blatant call out here to say Kate Colvin at Homelessness Australia, Emma Greenhalgh and her team at National Shelter do incredibly important work in that space. They've been surviving on grants and philanthropy since their funding was cut a few years ago. And I think it's really disappointing that their funding hasn't been restored in this budget, and it's something we'd like to see done very quickly ahead of the mid-year economic and fiscal update, ahead of the election. It's something that the government needs to act on now. So just a little plug there for our friends at the peak bodies who really do need that support. They deliver some of the most important services to some of the most vulnerable people in the country. That's just my little pitch for them. So forgive me for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for throwing that out there. I was really shocked to find out that they hadn't been receiving funding since the Morrison government. So I think it's something that needs to happen extremely urgently.
Absolutely. But let's get into what, from our what's in there and government policy wise. What are the downsides, Lucy? Because there's always downsides.
Yeah, I would definitely say that there are downsides within this document. I wouldn't say that they were unexpected, although they were still quite disappointing to see when I kind of went through it the first time. So the document is almost entirely focused on housing supply, and it doesn't really talk about any kind of factors that are driving up demand for housing. So there are lots of initiatives in there that aim to encourage the construction of new private and social housing. So that's things like the free training programs for workers in the construction sector, fast-tracking planning applications, and investment in infrastructure for new housing and development, as we talked about earlier.
All really important.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm not trying to suggest that these shouldn't have been included. However, the role of tax concessions for property investors is not mentioned once in the document. There's one tiny mention about tax incentives to create build-to-rent housing. That's currently being debated in the Senate, I believe. But there's the big ones that are billions and billions of dollars expenditure each year, capital gains tax and the negative gearing provisions are entirely absent. This goes against what we know about these tax concessions. So the introduction of capital gains tax in 1999 correlated with a massive boost of home purchases by property investors. And then we also know that our negative gearing allowances, which let property investors deduct rental losses from their broader taxable income, are really amongst the world's most lenient. And that makes investment in property more attractive. And it's kind of an incentive that doesn't exist in almost every other country in the world. And we also know that we spend billions of dollars on this each year. We should really be questioning whether this money would be better spent on meeting the housing challenges that the government does identify in that document. Should it be spent on constructing social housing, homelessness services, refunding those peak bodies like shelter?
Yeah, and it's a really important debate to have. I think if we go back to what we found on Whose Account in January, and I think, we'd like to think that our advocacy around pulling together the housing budget statements had some impact here. But we found that those tax concessions have grown from about $1.5 billion in 2000, so the first year after the capital gains tax discount was introduced. And we know that combined with negative gearing pushed people with any extra capacity to invest in property rather than anything else. But they've grown, the cost of those tax concessions have grown from $1.5 billion in 2000, and we think about $17 billion in 2024. It'll be more next year as interest rates go up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's a lot of money that's foregone revenue that would otherwise come to the government and be able to be spent on services like homelessness services or on social housing.
Absolutely. And we do know that these tax concessions aren't significantly encouraging supply of housing. The vast majority of home loans from investors go towards properties that already exist. They're not new builds. Overall, there's no real tangible impact on that housing supply challenge. That's really worth the amount of revenue that's being foregone, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I don't think you're alone in that opinion, Lucy. I think
No.
it's a widely
No.
shared view that, can we afford to keep subsidising the investments, the capital investments of people that are already, by definition, fairly comfortably off at the expense of putting a roof over the heads of those that are really struggling?
Absolutely.
Your analysis with our former colleague Matt Lloyd-Cape and myself back in January found that we used in 1993, right? So let's go back 30 years, and I can remember that time. But back then, the lowest 20% of households used to get around 44% of government spending on housing, and the highest only got 9%. But today, the highest income earners, the top 20% of income earners, get 43% of the benefit of either spending or foregone revenue in those tax concessions, and only 23% of what we spend is going to those the most in need. And I think people are quite shocked when they hear that.
Absolutely. And you think about the tangible effects of that. It means people aren't able to get onto the property ladder. They're not able to have their home as an asset when they retire. We do know that our retirement system is very built around home ownership in retirement.
Completely.
It protects lots of people from income poverty at that time. And so it's really financializing housing, and it's making it so detached from what it really is, which is a roof over our heads. It's a human right to access shelter, and it's becoming this wild speculative game that just gets out of control and it doesn't serve the needs of the vast majority of the population.
And I think most people, while, a lot of Australians have benefited in terms of their own personal wealth accumulation from those policies, from those tax policies over the last 25 years, there is a wider acceptance and growing concern now, even amongst some people that do invest, that actually, my kids aren't going to be able to buy a house. They're not going to be able to live near me. They can see all the uncertainty, people families living in tents in, regional areas. And there's a growing sense that we've got this badly wrong, which is for people like us a welcome development in the community. Because not only should housing be a form, a human right to shelter, but we know that having a secure home is the biggest predictor, as you say, of not just being able to retire in comfort, but raise a family, live a good life. It contributes to our social cohesion. It contributes to economic growth. People are better able to contribute if they've got a secure home. And really what happened at the turn of this century was tax policies were put in place that basically meant if you had any spare money at all, you should buy an investment property. And so a lot of people have done that and have taken on debt to do that. That then creates an unstable rental market and means that we're not investing as a country in things that could be more productive. Startups, investment in the transition to renewables. We were meant to become a nation of entrepreneurs and shareholders when the capital gains tax discount was introduced. That's what we were told would happen. And now all we've seen is a lot of rise in land prices and a generation locked out of secure home ownership.
Absolutely. And that's why I really do think that this housing statement just tells half the story. So they adequately diagnose half the problem, but without taking into context that broader investor-friendly housing system and the problems that we've already talked about with viewing housing as a vehicle for investment. It feels incomplete. It feels like, where do we go from this to really create a situation for the next generation? And I mean, I would like if it was for my generation as well, where we can have that security as we get older. If we want to start families, we want to move house, find a new job. We don't have that, I would say, almost dread hanging around us.
It's the most basic thing, I think, and rightly is going to be and will remain a growing issue ahead of the election next year. And while, my view is that I don't think this government was ever going to make big changes to property investor tax concessions in isolation, just as a tweak to the tax system, and nor should they, but that it needs to be considered as part of genuine tax reform in the next term of government, whomever holds the government benches. Less likely to happen, I think, if we don't get a Labor government returned. But it's essential that we look at the entire tax system and say, is this serving the interests of the country? Is it just funneling wealth to the already privileged and removing opportunity for everyone else? Or is our tax and transfer system acting in the best way to give people support when they need it and to provide the basics of life and then the opportunity for people to build their own pathway? So that's something we'll not be letting up on, huh? We'll be pushing for those significant changes.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to reflect on? I know you've got a paper coming out shortly on Commonwealth rent assistance and social housing comparison. Obviously, a big boost to CRA this year again, and given last year's boost, it's gone up by about 25% now. It's quite a big expenditure, isn't it? It's only reaching a small proportion of renters.
Yeah, and undoubtedly for lots of people, Commonwealth rent assistance is really helping lift them out of rental stress. In this report, we talk about the fact that there are lots of people who are still in rental stress after receiving Commonwealth rent assistance. Their incomes just aren't high enough to meet their housing needs. They might have need for additional bedrooms. They might have caring responsibilities. They might be in extremely tight rental markets where there just aren't enough properties available for everyone that needs them. So we talk a lot about whether or not subsidising private rentals is the best path forward. Do we need to really be investing in social housing to make sure that government can plan where the houses are located? They can limit rents based on income rather than landlords just picking a rent and hoping that Commonwealth rent assistance will be able to cover it. So that will be coming out in a few weeks' time, and we'll be talking a lot more about the way that we kind of subsidise private investment in that regard as well.
Yeah, it is another area in which over 30 years government shifted from being a non-market player in the housing system, which can, as we know, is the best form of rent control, to being a subsidiser of private property investment. CRA is another way that happens. So a bit of a hint there on which way that paper might land, but it's a very interesting one. It's coming out soon.
Yes,
by
and
Lucy,
podcast episode coming out on that very soon as well.
Absolutely. So watch this space. Well, that's all we've got time for. It is. We do, point to the team at Treasury and Finance, the Treasurer's office, Jim Chalmers' office, and say well done on this housing portfolio budget statement. But there's more to do, and we'll be making sure that we keep up the pressure to do so.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your analysis today, Lucy.
You're welcome. Very nice to chat about it.
Yeah, and we'll be back soon to talk about CRA versus social housing. But that is all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank our new sponsors, Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. And lastly, thank you, listener, for joining us for this episode of Recap. We have much more content coming your way in 2024. We are very proud to have added burning platforms to our roster of podcasts. So join Peter Lewis, convener for our Centre of the Public Square, every fortnight as he and his panel chat about the politics of big tech. Our Centre for Equitable Housing has a new series on the housing crisis, and they'll be debuting this very shortly. In fact, it's out now, and that's called Homes Not Houses. It's an investigative deep dive into the housing system in Australia, featuring some of Australia's leading experts and academics on housing in this country. Do check it out. It's a really great piece of work. And of course, we're also continuing to produce our live recordings of the John Cain Lunch Series, which we host in Melbourne every month, and our webinars. So make sure you subscribe to Per Capita either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Or if you want to get all the latest news from us, subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that at percapita.org.au. Thanks for being with us today, and join us next time when we'll continue to examine inequality and work towards a fairer Australia.